The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across Green River, Wyoming, as Penelope Harrington clutched her traveling bags and stared at the dusty Main Street before her. The year was 1878, and she had just arrived on the late afternoon stage, her city clothes and polished shoes marking her as clearly out of place as a peacock in a chicken coop. Behind her, the stagecoach driver tossed down her last trunk with an unceremonious thud before climbing back onto his seat, tipping his hat in farewell, and cracking his whip to send the team of horses trotting away, leaving Penelope alone with the dust settling around her ankles. The journey west from Boston had been long and arduous, but necessity had driven her here after her father's sudden death left her with nothing but debts, and a letter from her mother's cousin offering her a position as a schoolteacher in this frontier town. At 22, Penelope had never imagined herself in such a place, a single street lined with wooden buildings, the distant mountains looming beyond, and the distinctive smell of livestock, whiskey, and unwashed humanity permeating the air. "Miss Harrington, I presume." A woman's voice called out from the wooden sidewalk. Penelope turned to see a stout, gray-haired woman approaching with a purposeful stride. "Yes, madam, Margaret Wilson," the woman introduced herself with a firm handshake. "Town council secretary and cousin to your dear departed mother." "Welcome to Green River. Not much to look at compared to Boston, I imagine, but we make do." Penelope managed a weary smile. "I'm grateful for the opportunity, Mrs. Wilson." "Miss Wilson," the older woman corrected, "never found a man worth the trouble." "Now let's get you settled at the boarding house. School term starts Monday and the children are eager to meet their new teacher." As they walked, Miss Wilson pointed out the town's meager landmarks: the general store, the saloon, the church, the sheriff's office. Penelope tried to appear interested, but exhaustion tugged at her every limb. "You'll stay at Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house," Miss Wilson explained. "Decent place, clean sheets, and no men allowed upstairs. Sheriff keeps an eye on things, makes sure the ruffians from the saloon don't cause trouble." As they approached the two-story building at the end of the street, a commotion from the saloon across the way caught their attention. The swinging doors burst open and a man came flying out, landing face first in the dirt. Following him was a tall figure silhouetted against the golden light from inside. "And stay out, Jenkins," came a deep, authoritative voice. "You can come back when you've settled your tab." Miss Wilson clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "That's Rusty Dawson, owns the Half Moon Saloon. Trouble follows that man like flies on honey, but I'll give him credit, he runs the only respectable establishment of its kind for 50 miles. Penelope watched as the man called Rusty stepped fully into view. He wore a dark Stetson hat pulled low over his forehead, a faded red bandana at his throat, and a well-worn leather vest over a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to expose tanned, muscular forearms. A gun belt hung low on his hips, and even from a distance, she could see the intensity in his stance. As if sensing her gaze, he turned, and their eyes met across the dusty street. For a moment, Penelope felt rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the piercing blue eyes beneath the shadow of his hat brim. Then, with a slight tip of his hat, he turned and disappeared back into the saloon. "Best keep your distance from that one," Miss Wilson advised, misreading Penelope's stunned expression as fear. "He's not the type for a proper lady such as yourself." Penelope nodded absently, but something about those blue eyes stayed with her as they continued to the boarding house. Little did she know that the man she just glimpsed would soon turn her carefully planned new life completely upside down. The boarding house proved to be clean and comfortable, if sparse. Mrs. Abernathy, a widow with a perpetually worried expression, showed Penelope to a small room on the second floor. "Breakfast at 6, dinner at 6 in the evening," Mrs. Abernathy explained. "No gentlemen callers in the rooms, no alcohol, no coming in after 9 o'clock. The bathroom is down the hall, you'll have to share with the other ladies." "Thank you," Penelope said, surveying the narrow bed, simple washstand, and small writing desk that would be her home for the foreseeable future. "The school's just past the church," Mrs. Abernathy continued. About 20 children ages 5 to 16. They can be a handful, especially the ranch boys. Been without a proper teacher since old Mr. Finch passed last winter. After Mrs. Abernathy left, Penelope sank onto the bed and finally allowed herself a moment of doubt. What had she done, coming to this rough frontier town so far from everything familiar? She was no adventurer, just a desperate woman with few options. Her education at the Boston Ladies' Academy had prepared her to be a proper wife, or perhaps a governess in a fine home, not a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse in Wyoming territory. But there was no turning back. This was her life now, and she would make the best of it. The next morning, Penelope rose early, dressed in her most practical skirt and shirtwaist, and pinned her chestnut hair into a severe bun that she hoped conveyed authority. After a simple breakfast of biscuits and gravy, she made her way to the schoolhouse to prepare for Monday's classes. The building was even more modest than she'd imagined, a single room with rough-hewn benches, a pot-bellied stove in one corner, and a chalkboard mounted on the wall behind a teacher's desk. Dust covered every surface, and several windows had cracks in the glass. With a sigh, Penelope set to work, rolling up her sleeves and attacking the dust with a determination born of desperation. She was on her hands and knees scrubbing the floor when the door creaked open. "Don't usually find city ladies doing honest work," came a deep, amused voice. Penelope looked up to find Rusty Dawson leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest. In the morning light, she could see him clearly for the first time, tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin, that striking blue gaze, and a day's worth of stubble on his strong jaw. His dark hair curled slightly where it emerged from beneath his hat. "Mr. Dawson, isn't it?" she asked, rising to her feet and attempting to brush the dust from her skirt with dignity. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. "Word travels fast." "Small towns usually operate that way, I believe," she replied, trying to ignore the way her heart had inexplicably quickened. "And you're the new schoolteacher." It wasn't a question, Penelope Harrington. She offered a slight curtsy out of habit, immediately feeling foolish for the formal gesture. The corner of his mouth twitched upward. "What brings a Boston lady to Green River? Must be quite the story." "How did you know I'm from Boston? Your accent." "And those fancy boots aren't made for Wyoming dust." His eyes traveled down to her now dirt-stained footwear. Penelope lifted her chin. "I don't believe my personal circumstances are any of your business, Mr. Dawson," he chuckled, a rich sound that sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Fair enough, just thought you might want these." He held up a set of keys. "Town council asked me to drop them by, one's for the school, one's for the supply cabinet in the back." "Oh," Penelope felt a flush of embarrassment. "Thank you." He crossed the room and handed her the keys, his fingers brushing against hers momentarily. "Word of advice, Miss Harrington, Green River isn't Boston. People here value straightforwardness over manners. You'll win more respect by speaking your mind than by acting the proper lady." Before she could formulate a response, he tipped his hat and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "There's a town gathering at my place tomorrow night. Saturday tradition, dancing, music, decent food. Might help you get to know the folks whose children you'll be teaching. At your saloon." Penelope couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "The Half Moon is more than just a saloon," he said with a hint of defensiveness. "It's the only place in town big enough for community gatherings. Even the preacher comes, though he pretends it's just to save souls." With a wink, he added, 7 o'clock, where something you can move in." With that, he was gone, leaving Penelope staring at the closed door, the keys cool against her palm and her mind filled with conflicting thoughts. A dance at a saloon was hardly appropriate for a schoolteacher trying to establish a respectable reputation. Yet the idea of spending another evening alone in her boarding house room held little appeal. She turned back to her cleaning, pushing thoughts of blue eyes and a disarming smile from her mind. She had come to Green River to teach, not to be distracted by a charming saloon owner with a reputation for trouble. The following evening, however, found Penelope standing before the small mirror in her room, adjusting the pins in her hair. She had loosened her usual tight bun into a softer style and changed into her one good dress, a deep blue that brought out the amber flecks in her brown eyes. She told herself she was simply making an effort to meet the parents of her future students, nothing more. As the clock struck 7, she made her way downstairs, earning a disapproving glance from Mrs. Abernathy. "The saloon gathering, I presume?" the landlady asked with a sniff. "I thought it would be a good opportunity to meet the townspeople," Penelope explained. "Just mind your reputation, Miss Harrington. Teachers are held to a higher standard than most." With that warning echoing in her ears, Penelope stepped out into the cool evening air. The half-moon saloon was lit up like a beacon, and the sounds of laughter and music spilled into the street. Taking a deep breath, she crossed the road and pushed through the swinging doors. Inside, the saloon had been transformed. Tables had been pushed to the walls to create a dance floor, and colorful bunting hung from the rafters. A small band played in one corner, and the bar was serving what appeared to be punch alongside the usual stronger fare. To Penelope's surprise, the room was filled with families, women in their best dresses, men in clean shirts, and even children darting between the adults. "Miss Harrington?" A familiar voice called over the music, and Rusty appeared before her, looking so different she almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the dusty working attire, replaced by a clean white shirt, dark vest, and pressed trousers. His hair was combed back and he'd shaved, revealing a strong jawline and a dimple in his right cheek when he smiled. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, genuine pleasure in his eyes. "I thought it wise to meet the community," she replied, striving for a professional tone despite the flutter in her stomach. "Of course." His smile suggested he didn't believe her for a second. "Let me introduce you around." What followed was a whirlwind of names and faces: the blacksmith and his wife, the general store owner, the young doctor who'd moved from Denver the previous year, ranchers from the surrounding area, and countless others whose children would soon be under her care. Everyone welcomed her with curiosity and surprising warmth. "See, not so bad," Rusty said as he handed her a cup of punch. "I admit, this isn't what I expected," Penelope confessed. "When you said saloon, I imagined painted ladies and drunken cowboys shooting up the place," he laughed. "We save that for Tuesdays." When she looked alarmed, he added, "That was a joke, Miss Harrington. The Half Moon might serve whiskey, but it's a respectable establishment. This town has enough hard edges without adding more." Before she could respond, the band struck up a lively tune and couples began to fill the dance floor. "Dance with me," Rusty said suddenly, setting down his punch and offering his hand. Penelope hesitated. "I'm not sure that would be appropriate given my position." "Look around," he encouraged. Sheriff's dancing with the milliner, Doc's dancing with the preacher's wife. One dance won't ruin your reputation. She glanced at his outstretched hand, temptation warring with propriety. "I should warn you, I'm not particularly skilled at Western dances." "We waltzed in Boston, but I suspect that's not what your band is playing." "Trust me," he said with a grin that made her heart skip. "Just step where I step." Against her better judgment, Penelope placed her hand in his and allowed him to lead her onto the dance floor. The music was fast and unfamiliar, the steps complex, but Rusty guided her with unexpected grace, his hand firm at her waist, his eyes never leaving hers. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, he counted quietly for her benefit. "Now turn, that's it." Despite his guidance, Penelope stumbled, stepping on his toes and losing the rhythm. Around them, several onlookers chuckled at her awkwardness, and she felt her face grow hot with embarrassment. "Looks like our new teacher has 2 left feet," someone called out, prompting more laughter. Penelope started to pull away, mortified, but Rusty's grip tightened slightly. "Ignore them," he said softly. "They laughed when my sister tried to dance her first time too. Just step where I step, remember?" Something in his steadfast gaze gave her courage. Penelope straightened her shoulders, focused on his movements, and tried again. Rusty slowed his pace slightly, exaggerating his steps so she could follow more easily. "That's it," he encouraged as she began to catch on. "Now you're getting it." By the end of the song, Penelope was flushed and breathless, but moving with more confidence. When the music ended, several people applauded her improvement, their earlier mockery forgotten. "Thank you," she said to Rusty as they moved off the dance floor, "for not letting me give up." "Persistence is a valuable trait in these parts," he replied. "Wyoming doesn't reward quitters." "Mr. Dawson, Rusty," he corrected. "Everyone calls me Rusty." "Rusty," she amended, testing the name on her tongue. "May I ask you something?" "Shoot." "Why a saloon, you seem—" "I don't know, different from what I expected." His expression grew more serious. "My father built this place after the war, said he'd seen enough killing to last a lifetime, wanted to create somewhere people could find a bit of joy." He glanced around the room with pride. "When he died 5 years ago, I took over. It's not always an easy business, but it matters to this town. Might not be respectable by Boston standards, but out here, a good saloon is as important as a church." Penelope found herself wanting to know more about this complex man who defied her expectations at every turn, but before she could ask another question, Miss Wilson appeared at her elbow. "I see you've met our Rusty," the older woman said with a pointed look. "I hope he's behaving himself." "Mr. Dawson has been a perfect gentleman," Penelope assured her, noticing the flash of amusement in Rusty's eyes at her formal tone. "Well, I thought I should introduce you to Mrs. Henderson," Miss Wilson continued. "She's on the school board and has some thoughts about the curriculum." With an apologetic glance at Rusty, Penelope allowed herself to be led away to meet yet another important townswoman. For the rest of the evening, she was passed from introduction to introduction, but her gaze kept returning to the tall figure of the saloon owner as he moved through the crowd, greeting everyone with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. It was nearly 11 when Penelope finally slipped out of the saloon, knowing Mrs. Abernathy would be locking the doors soon. The night air had turned chilly, and she wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she hurried across the street. "Miss Harrington," a voice called from behind her. She turned to see Rusty jogging to catch up. "Mr. Dawson, Rusty," she corrected herself. "I was just heading back. I know, wouldn't be gentlemanly to let you walk alone, even if it is just across the street." He fell into step beside her. "I didn't realize saloon owners were so concerned with being gentlemanly. Only with schoolteachers who can't dance," he teased. "I was dreadful, wasn't I?" She laughed softly. "You improved, that's what counts." They reached the boarding house steps and Penelope turned to face him. In the moonlight, his features were softer, less guarded than they'd been in the daytime. "Thank you for tonight," she said. "You were right, it was a good way to meet everyone." "Does this mean you'll come back next Saturday?" he asked, a hopeful note in his voice that made her pulse quicken. Prudence dictated she decline. Getting too friendly with the local saloon owner would only fuel gossip, especially once school started, but something about Rusty Dawson made Prudence seem overrated. "Perhaps," she replied with a small smile, "if my dance lessons continue." The look that crossed his face was worth the risk of impropriety. "I'm an excellent teacher, Miss Harrington." "Penelope," she said impulsively. "If I'm to call you Rusty, you should call me Penelope." "Penelope," he repeated, the name sounding different in his deep voice. "Sleep well." With a tip of his hat, he turned and walked back toward the saloon, leaving Penelope standing on the porch steps, wondering what she had gotten herself into. Monday morning arrived with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Penelope reached the schoolhouse an hour early, arranging books and writing the day's lessons on the chalkboard with care. By 8 o'clock, children began to file in, some eager, some reluctant, all curious about their new teacher. "Good morning," Penelope greeted them with what she hoped was an authoritative yet welcoming smile. "I'm Miss Harrington, and I'll be your teacher this year." 20 pairs of eyes stared back at her with expressions ranging from interest to skepticism to outright rebellion, particularly from a group of older boys who slouched in the back row. "Before we begin, I'd like to learn your names," she said, picking up her slate. "When I call on you, please stand and tell me your name and age." The morning progressed better than she'd feared. Most of the children were respectful if not enthusiastic, and by lunchtime, Penelope felt she was establishing some rapport with them. Only the group of older boys remained aloof, whispering among themselves and barely participating. As the children filed out for their midday meal, one of these boys, Billy Thompson, son of a local rancher, deliberately knocked over an inkwell, sending black liquid spreading across Penelope's carefully written lesson plans. "Oops," he said with mock innocence. "Guess I'm just clumsy, madam." Penelope met his challenging gaze. "Since you're so interested in penmanship, Billy, you can stay after school today and help me practice by writing 'I will respect school property' 50 times. The boy's face darkened. "My pa won't like that. He needs me at the ranch." "Then I suggest you be more careful tomorrow," Penelope replied, refusing to be intimidated. "You're dismissed." The afternoon went much the same way, with small tests of her authority that she met with firm but fair responses. By the time the final bell rang, Penelope was exhausted but satisfied with her first day. Billy Thompson grudgingly completed his punishment, and the other children seemed to have accepted that their new teacher wouldn't be easily bullied. As she was gathering her things to leave, the schoolhouse door opened and Rusty stepped in, hat in hand. "Heard you had your first day," he said. "Thought I'd check how it went." "News travels fast," she commented, surprised by how pleased she was to see him. "Small town." He shrugged. "Did the Thompson boy give you trouble? He's got a reputation." "Nothing I couldn't handle," Penelope assured him, "though I suspect I haven't seen the last of his testing." Rusty leaned against a desk, studying her with those penetrating blue eyes. "You're tougher than you look, Boston. Suits you better than Miss Harrington, at least when it's just us talking." The casual intimacy implied by his words sent a warm flutter through her chest. "Is that so?" He grinned, unrepentant. "Walk with me. Town's having a meeting about the Harvest Festival next month." "Since you're the teacher, you should probably be there." Penelope hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I suppose that would be appropriate." As they walked down the dusty main street side by side, several townspeople nodded greetings, a few eyebrows raising at the sight of the new teacher in the company of Rusty Dawson. Penelope felt a momentary pang of concern about her reputation, but it was outweighed by the enjoyment of Rusty's company. "So why teaching?" he asked as they walked. "You don't strike me as someone who grew up dreaming of instructing frontier children." "Necessity," Penelope admitted. "After my father died, I needed employment. Teaching was one of the few respectable options for a woman with my education." "And why Green River? Surely there were schools closer to Boston." She hesitated before deciding honesty was simplest. "My father left substantial debts. The creditors were persistent. When my mother's cousin wrote about the position here, it seemed like a providential escape. Running away." There was no judgment in his tone. "Starting over," she corrected. "What about you? Have you always lived here?" "Born and raised," he confirmed. "Left for a few years, did some cowboying in Montana, tried my luck in the Colorado silver mines. But Green River pulls you back." "You could have been anything," Penelope observed. "Why take over your father's saloon?" His expression grew distant. "My father built the Half Moon from nothing. When I came back and found him dying of consumption, I promised I'd keep it going." He glanced at her. "Besides, it's not such a bad life. I meet interesting people." The warmth in his eyes as he looked at her made Penelope's cheeks flush, and she was grateful when they reached the town hall, ending their private conversation. Inside, it seemed most of Green River had gathered to discuss the upcoming Harvest Festival, traditionally held in late September to celebrate the end of the growing season. "It's the biggest event of the year," Margaret Wilson explained to Penelope as they took seats near the front. "Everyone from 50 miles around comes for the contests, the food, the dancing." The meeting proceeded with typical small-town efficiency, with committees formed for decorations, food, and activities. When the topic of entertainment arose, Penelope was surprised to hear her name called. "The school children always perform," Miss Wilson informed her. "Songs, recitations, that sort of thing. As the teacher, you'll be in charge of preparing them." "I see," Penelope said, mentally adding this responsibility to her growing list of duties. "And of course, the dance is the highlight of the festival," continued the mayor, a portly man named Jameson. "Rusty, your place still available?" From his position leaning against the wall, Rusty nodded. "As always, though the new floor won't be finished until next week. New floor. Someone asked, thought it was time, Rusty replied with a casual shrug, though his eyes briefly met Penelope's. The old one had too many splinters for dancing. The meeting continued, but Penelope found her attention drawn repeatedly to Rusty. Had he really replaced his floor because of her stumbling attempts at dancing? The thought seemed presumptuous, yet the timing was suggestive. After the meeting concluded, Penelope found herself surrounded by mothers eager to discuss their children's progress and potential roles in the festival performance. By the time she extricated herself, Rusty had disappeared, and she felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. The following weeks fell into a rhythm. Weekdays were filled with teaching, while evenings were dedicated to grading papers and preparing lessons. Penelope gradually won the respect of most of her students. Even Billy Thompson, who discovered her love of geology matched his own fascination with rocks and minerals. Saturday nights at the Half Moon became a guilty pleasure she couldn't quite bring herself to forego. True to his word, Rusty proved an excellent dance instructor, patiently teaching her the steps to various country dances until she could join in without embarrassment. Their weekly lessons became the highlight of her carefully structured life, a few precious hours when she could set aside the prim schoolteacher persona and simply enjoy herself. "You're a natural," Rusty told her one evening as they finished a particularly energetic reel, her cheeks flushed with exertion and pleasure. "A natural who stepped on your toes for 3 straight weeks," she laughed. "Worth every bruise," he replied with a wink that made her heart flutter. As September approached, Penelope found herself increasingly busy with harvest festival preparations. The children were practicing a selection of patriotic songs and recitations. Costumes were being sewn, and the excitement in town was palpable. One evening, as Penelope was working late at the schoolhouse, the door opened to reveal Rusty carrying a covered basket. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, setting the basket on her desk. "Mrs. Jenkins at the cafe mentioned you missed dinner." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Penelope deeply. "You didn't have to do that. Can't have our teacher fainting from hunger," he replied with a casualness that didn't quite mask his concern. "Besides, I wanted to show you something." Curious, Penelope followed him outside where a wagon waited. "What is this about? Trust me," was all he would say as he helped her up onto the seat. They rode out of town as the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. About a mile outside Green River, Rusty turned the wagon onto a small track that wound up a gentle slope. At the top, he stopped and helped her down. "This is what I wanted you to see," he said, gesturing toward the view. Penelope gasped. Spread before them was the entire valley, with Green River nestled in its center, the actual river gleaming like a silver ribbon in the fading light, and the mountains rising majestically in the distance. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "My father used to bring me up here when I was a boy," Rusty said, his voice soft with memory. "Said a man needs to step back sometimes to appreciate what he has." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Why did you really bring me here, Rusty?" Penelope finally asked, turning to face him. In the twilight, his expression was difficult to read, but his voice was serious when he answered. "Because in all the times I've come up here, I've never wanted to share it with anyone before now." The significance of his words hung in the air between them. Penelope knew she stood at a crossroads. She could step back, maintain the proper distance between them, or acknowledge the growing feelings she tried to deny. "I'm glad you showed me," she said softly, choosing a middle path. "It's good to be reminded that there's beauty in this harsh land." If he was disappointed by her cautious response, Rusty didn't show it. Instead, he spread a blanket on the ground and unpacked the basket he'd brought, revealing a simple but delicious meal of fried chicken, biscuits, and apple pie. As they ate under the stars, their conversation flowed easily from school matters to town gossip to more personal revelations. Penelope found herself telling him about her childhood in Boston, her dreams of traveling to Europe, and her fear that coming to Wyoming meant the end of those aspirations. "Why should it?" Rusty asked. Wyoming's just a starting point. The territory's changing. Women can vote here, did you know that? Own property too. There's opportunity here that you wouldn't find back east. I never thought of it that way, Penelope admitted. I've been so focused on what I left behind that I haven't considered what might be possible here. That's the thing about the West, Rusty said, leaning back on his elbows and looking up at the star-filled sky. It's all about what's possible, not what's proper. His words stayed with Penelope long after he'd driven her back to town and bid her good night at the boarding house steps. She lay awake in her narrow bed, thinking about possibilities and choices, and wondering if she had the courage to build a life so different from the one she'd been raised to expect. The week of the Harvest Festival arrived with perfect autumn weather, crisp mornings giving way to warm, golden afternoons. The entire town was decorated with bunting, corn shocks, and colorful gourds. Farmers and ranchers from the surrounding areas began to arrive, setting up temporary camps on the outskirts of town. On the morning of the festival, Penelope gathered her students at the schoolhouse for a final rehearsal of their performance. "Remember, children," she instructed, "speak clearly and stand tall. Your parents will be watching and we want to make them proud." "Miss Harrington," little Sarah Jenkins piped up, "are you going to dance with Mr. Dawson tonight? My ma says he's sweet on you." The innocent question brought immediate silence to the room, all eyes turning to Penelope, who felt heat rising in her cheeks. "That's not an appropriate topic for school discussion, Sarah," she managed to reply with as much dignity as she could muster. "Now, let's practice America the Beautiful once more." By midday, the festival was in full swing. Main Street had been transformed into a fairground, with booths selling everything from quilts to jams to handcrafted tools. Contests were underway for the biggest pumpkin, the best apple pie, the fastest horse. Children darted through the crowds, their faces sticky with candy and excitement. Penelope moved through it all in a haze of responsibility, ensuring her students were ready for their afternoon performance. She hadn't seen Rusty all day, though she knew he was busy preparing the saloon for the evening's dance. The children's performance went off without a major mishap, despite Tommy Wilson forgetting the second verse of "My Country 'Tis of Thee," and Emma Gardner dropping her flag during the patriotic tableau. Parents applauded enthusiastically, and Penelope felt a surge of pride in her students' accomplishment. As the sun began to set, the festival moved toward its culminating event, the harvest dance at the half moon. Penelope hurried back to the boarding house to change into her best dress, a russet-colored gown that complemented her auburn hair and brown eyes. For once, she left her hair only partially pinned up, allowing soft curls to frame her face. "My goodness, Mrs. Abernathy commented when Penelope descended the stairs. "You look positively radiant, Miss Harrington." "Thank you," Penelope replied, unable to deny the flutter of anticipation in her stomach. The half-moon was transformed when she arrived. Lanterns hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the newly installed wooden floor. Tables laden with food lined one wall, and the band was setting up in the corner. People streamed in, dressed in their finest clothes, greeting each other with the easy familiarity of a close-knit community. Penelope searched the room for Rusty, finally spotting him behind the bar, deep in conversation with Sheriff Miller. As if sensing her presence, he looked up, and their eyes met across the crowded room. The smile that spread across his face made her heart skip a beat. "Miss Harrington," he greeted as he approached her, his eyes taking in her appearance with obvious appreciation. "You look beautiful tonight." "Thank you," she replied, noting that he too had dressed for the occasion in a new black vest and crisp white shirt. "The saloon looks wonderful." "Everyone has done such a marvelous job with the festival. Wait until you see the new floor in action," he said with a grin. "Smooth as glass, you won't trip even once." "Is that a challenge, Mr. Dawson?" "More like a promise, Boston." When the band struck up the first dance, Rusty didn't even ask, simply extending his hand with a confidence that assumed her acceptance. And indeed, Penelope didn't hesitate to place her hand in his, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor. True to his word, the new floor was perfectly smooth, and months of Saturday night practice had made Penelope a competent dancer. They moved together with an ease that felt like a conversation without words, his hand steady at her waist, her steps matching his as if they'd been dancing together for years. "Look at you now," he murmured as they turned gracefully among the other couples. "A long way from that first night when they laughed at your dancing." "I had a good teacher," she replied. "Just step where you step, isn't that what you said?" His eyes held hers. "Some lessons are worth learning slowly." The evening progressed in a whirl of dances, conversations, and laughter. Penelope found herself the center of attention from several eligible ranchers and the young doctor, but she always returned to Rusty, drawn by something deeper than his handsome face and charming manner. As the night wore on, the music slowed and couples held each other closer on the dance floor. When Rusty pulled Penelope into his arms for a waltz, she knew she should maintain a proper distance, but the warmth of his hand on her back and the intensity in his eyes made propriety seem irrelevant. "I've been thinking," he said as they swayed to the music, "about possibilities." "Oh." She managed, her heart beating faster. "You came to Green River running from something," he continued, "but I'm hoping you might consider staying for something else." Before she could respond, a commotion at the door interrupted the moment. Sheriff Miller pushed through the crowd, his face grim. "Rusty," he called, "got trouble. Jenkins and his boys are stirring up problems at the camp by the river, something about a card game and accusations of cheating." Rusty's expression darkened. "Damn it, not tonight." He turned to Penelope. "I'm sorry, I have to deal with this." "Of course," she said, trying to hide her disappointment. "Don't leave," he urged, his hand tightening briefly on hers. "We're not finished with this conversation." Then he was gone, following the sheriff out into the night, leaving Penelope standing alone on the dance floor, the unfinished moment hanging between them like a promise. The interruption stretched from minutes into an hour. The dancing continued, but attention had entered the festivities, with people glancing frequently at the door. Penelope tried to enjoy herself, dancing with other partners and making conversation, but her thoughts remained with Rusty. Finally, unable to bear the waiting any longer, she slipped outside for some fresh air. The night was cool, the street illuminated by a full harvest moon that cast everything in silver light. From the direction of the river, she could hear raised voices. Drawn by concern and curiosity, Penelope followed the sounds, her dancing slippers silent on the dusty road. As she approached the makeshift camp where visitors to the festival had set up tents and wagons, she saw a crowd gathered around two men locked in heated argument. One was Rusty, his stance tense but controlled. The other was a burly stranger with a bushy beard and a face flushed with drink and anger. Sheriff Miller stood between them, attempting to defuse the situation. "I'm telling you, Dawson, your dealer was cheating," the stranger bellowed. "No man gets 4 kings honest, and I'm telling you, Jenkins, that if Mike was cheating, it wasn't on my orders," Rusty replied, his voice level but with an edge of steel. "You lost fair and square." "Liar." Jenkins lunged forward, pushing past the sheriff to take a wild swing at Rusty. Rusty dodged easily, his movements quick and practiced. "Go home, Jenkins, sleep it off. You're welcome back when you're sober." "The hell I will." Jenkins reached for the gun at his hip. Everything happened in a blur. The sheriff shouted a warning. Rusty moved with lightning speed, and suddenly the two men were grappling for control of Jenkins' pistol. The crowd scattered as the gun went off, the report echoing across the quiet night. For a horrifying moment, Penelope couldn't tell who had been hit. Then Jenkins stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder while Rusty remained standing, his expression grim. "Someone get Doc Henderson," Sheriff Miller ordered, moving to restrain the injured Jenkins. Penelope rushed forward without thinking. "Rusty, are you hurt?" He turned at the sound of her voice, surprise and then concern crossing his face. "Penelope, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be seeing this." "I was worried when you didn't return," she explained, her eyes searching him for any sign of injury. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," he assured her, though she noticed he was holding his left arm awkwardly. "The bullet just grazed me. Jenkins got the worst of it, his own fault for pulling a gun." You're bleeding, Penelope said, noticing the dark stain spreading on his sleeve. It's nothing. Don't be stubborn, she insisted, tearing a strip from her petticoat. Let me bind it until the doctor can look at it properly. Around them, the situation was calming. Jenkins was being treated by those nearby while they waited for the doctor, and the sheriff was dispersing the crowd. In the midst of the chaos, Penelope and Rusty created a small island of calm as she tended to his wound. You surprise me, Boston, Rusty said softly as she tied off the makeshift bandage. Most ladies would have fainted at the sight of blood. I'm not most ladies, she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. And I think we've established that I'm tougher than I look. His free hand came up to touch her cheek. Yes, you are, and braver than you give yourself credit for. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Doc Henderson, who insisted on examining Rusty's arm immediately. As the doctor worked, Sheriff Miller approached Penelope. Miss Harrington, I should escort you back to town, he said. This is no place for a lady, especially the schoolteacher. Penelope hesitated, looking at Rusty, who nodded reluctantly. Go with him, Boston. I'll come find you once the doc is finished with me. The walk back to town with the sheriff was silent and uncomfortable. Penelope could sense his disapproval of her presence at the scene, and she feared what this might mean for her reputation in the community. Sheriff, she finally said as they neared the boarding house, I hope you won't think badly of me for following the commotion. I was concerned about Mr. Dawson. Miller's weathered face softened slightly. Miss Harrington, folks in Green River aren't blind. We've all seen how things stand between you and Rusty. When she started to protest, he held up a hand. No need for denial. Rusty Dawson is a good man, better than most give him credit for, but his life isn't an easy one. The half-moon puts him in the middle of every dispute, every drunk's bad decision. That's a lot for any woman to take on. I appreciate your concern, Penelope said carefully, but I believe I'm capable of making my own judgments about people. Fair enough, Miller conceded. Just know what you're choosing. With a tip of his hat, he left her at the boarding house steps. Penelope entered quietly, relieved to find the common areas dark and empty. Mrs. Abernathy must have already retired for the night. She climbed the stairs to her room, her mind churning with the events of the evening. She had just changed out of her festival dress into a simpler one when a soft knock came at her window. Startled, she turned to see Rusty perched precariously on the branch of the oak tree that grew beside the boarding house. Penelope rushed to open the window. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "If Mrs. Abernathy finds you here, I'll be thrown out." "Then let me in before I fall and break my neck," he replied with a grin that belied the seriousness of his bandaged arm. Against her better judgment, Penelope stepped back to allow him to climb through the window. He moved with the agility of someone who had performed such maneuvers before, a thought that brought a flicker of irrational jealousy. "Your arm," she said, noticing how carefully he favored it. "What did the doctor say?" "Clean graze. I've had worse from shaving." He glanced around her small, neat room with interest. "So this is where the proper Miss Harrington lives." "Rusty, you shouldn't be here," Penelope said, though she made no move to send him away. "It's completely inappropriate." Climbing a tree with a bullet wound to see a woman who ran toward gunfire instead of away from it, he asked with raised eyebrows. "I'd say we're well past appropriate, Boston." He had a point. Penelope sank onto the edge of her bed. Tonight was illuminating. "I'm sorry you had to see that side of things," Rusty said, his expression growing serious as he sat beside her. "It's not usually so dramatic." "The sheriff warned me about your life," she admitted. "He seemed to think I should consider carefully before." She trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. "Before what?" Rusty asked, his voice soft but intent. Penelope met his gaze directly. "Before allowing myself to care for you more than I already do." The confession hung in the air between them. Rusty's eyes darkened and he reached out to take her hand. "And what did you decide?" he asked. "That I already care too much to heed his warning," she replied simply. "That running away once was enough, that some risks are worth taking." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I was hoping you'd say something like that." He raised her hand to his lips. Because I've been falling in love with you since the moment you stumbled over my feet at that first dance. The words sent a thrill through Penelope's entire body. Even though I'm a proper Boston lady who doesn't belong in your wild Western world, especially because of that, he said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. You bring something to Green River that it never had before. Something I never had before. And what's that? She whispered, leaning closer to him. Hope, he answered simply. Hope for something more than just surviving out here. Hope for a real life, a family, a future worth building. Penelope's heart swelled with emotion. Rusty Dawson, are you asking me to be part of that future? I'm asking if you could see yourself loving a saloon owner with a questionable reputation and a habit of getting into trouble, he replied, his voice rough with feeling. I already do, she said, the words coming easier than she'd imagined. I love the man who taught me to dance when others laughed. I love the man who puts himself between trouble and his town. I love the man who sees possibilities instead of limitations. Rusty's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as if she were something infinitely precious. Penelope Harrington, you are the most surprising, frustrating, wonderful woman I've ever met. When he kissed her, it was like coming home to a place she'd never been before, both familiar and thrillingly new. His lips were warm and certain against hers, his hand sliding into her hair as he pulled her closer. Penelope gave herself to the kiss completely, all thoughts of propriety forgotten in the joy of finally acknowledging what had been growing between them for months. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Rusty rested his forehead against hers. I should go before I ruin your reputation beyond repair, he murmured, though he made no move to leave. My reputation seems a small price to pay, she replied with a smile. Not to me. He straightened, his expression becoming serious again. I want to do this right, Boston. I want the whole town to know that what's between us isn't something shameful or temporary. What are you saying? I'm saying that tomorrow. I'm going to walk right up to your boarding house door in broad daylight and ask permission to court you properly, he declared. And then, if you'll have me, I'm going to marry you before the first snow falls. The boldness of his declaration took Penelope's breath away. Isn't that rather fast? Welcome to Wyoming, he grinned. We don't waste time once we know what we want. And what about my teaching position? She asked, practical concerns intruding on the romantic moment. The school board might not approve of a married teacher. Then I'll build you your own school, Rusty said without hesitation. Or you can teach at the saloon, or not teach at all if that's what you want. He took both her hands in his. The point is, Boston, I'm not asking you to give up your dreams, I'm asking if I can be part of them. Put that way, the decision seemed simple. Yes, Penelope said, her heart full. Yes to courting, yes to marriage, yes to building something together. His smile was radiant as he kissed her again, this time a quick, joyful press of lips. I should go before I decide not to leave at all. Will I see you tomorrow? She asked as he moved toward the window. First thing, he promised, after I visit the jeweler. With one last grin, he slipped out the window and down the tree with surprising agility for a man with a bullet wound. Penelope watched until he disappeared into the shadows, then closed the window and leaned against it, her heart lighter than it had been in years. True to his word, Rusty appeared at the boarding house door the following morning, clean-shaven and dressed in his Sunday best, despite it being Monday. He formally requested Mrs. Abernathy's permission to call on Penelope, a gesture that both amused and touched the usually stern landlady. Well, it's about time, Mrs. Abernathy declared, surprising them both. The whole town's been waiting for you two to stop dancing around each other, though I expect Miss Harrington to maintain propriety under my roof until the wedding. Yes, madam, Rusty agreed with perfect seriousness, though his eyes twinkled when they met Penelope's. Word spread quickly through Green River. By the time Penelope reached the schoolhouse, her students were buzzing with the news. Are you really going to marry Mr. Dawson, Miss Harrington? Sarah Jenkins asked eagerly as soon as Penelope entered. Children, that's not an appropriate topic for Penelope began, then stopped herself, remembering Rusty's words about the West valuing possibilities over propriety. Yes, Sarah, Mr. Dawson has asked to court me, and if all goes well, we plan to marry before winter." The children's reactions ranged from delighted squeals to thoughtful nods. Billy Thompson, who had become something of an ally over the past month, raised his hand. "Yes, Billy," Penelope acknowledged. "Does this mean you'll be living at the saloon, madam?" he asked with the directness of youth. "My pa says that's no place for a lady." Penelope considered her answer carefully. "Mr. Dawson and I have many details to work out, Billy, but remember, places are what we make of them. The Half Moon isn't just a saloon, it's a gathering place for the community, as we saw at the Harvest Festival." This explanation seemed to satisfy the children, and Penelope was able to direct their attention to the day's lessons. However, she found her own thoughts continually drifting to Rusty and the future they had committed to building together. Over the following weeks, Rusty courted her with a combination of frontier practicality and surprising romance. They took rides into the surrounding countryside, shared meals with friends and neighbors, and spent long evenings talking about their hopes and plans. Each Saturday night, they still danced together at the Half Moon, but now there was no need to hide the affection between them. The school board, after some initial hesitation, agreed that Penelope could continue teaching after her marriage, a decision influenced by the practical reality that qualified teachers were scarce in Wyoming territory. Miss Wilson, who turned out to be a romantic at heart, was already organizing a committee to plan the wedding. One crisp October evening, as golden leaves drifted from the trees along Green River's Main Street, Rusty took Penelope back to the hilltop where they had shared their first real conversation. "I wanted to show you something," he said, helping her down from the wagon. "The view is as beautiful as I remember," Penelope commented, taking in the panorama of the valley below, now touched with autumn colors. "Not the view," Rusty said with a mysterious smile. "This." He pointed to a cleared area on the flat part of the hilltop where stakes had been driven into the ground, forming the outline of what appeared to be a building. "What is it?" Penelope asked, puzzled. "Our home," Rusty replied, watching her face carefully. "If you approve, of course." "I bought this land last week. It's close enough to town for your teaching, but far enough for privacy." He took her hand, leading her into the staked-out area. "Here would be the parlor with windows facing the view. There's the kitchen, big enough for when we have guests. Bedrooms down that way, I thought 3 to start, with room to add more if we need them." Penelope's heart swelled as she visualized the home he was describing. "It's perfect," she said, squeezing his hand, "though I hadn't realized you were thinking of leaving the saloon." "I'm not exactly," Rusty clarified. "I'll still own and run the Half Moon, but we don't have to live above it. I thought you might prefer a proper home, especially when we start a family." The casual way he referenced their future children sent a warm glow through Penelope. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" "I've had nothing but time to think about making you happy," he said, pulling her into his arms, "and a lifetime ahead to make it happen." As they sealed this promise with a kiss, Penelope marveled at how far she had come from the frightened young woman who had stepped off the stage coach just a few months earlier. She had found not just safety and employment in Green River, but a home, a community, and a love she had never dared to imagine. The wedding took place on the first Saturday of November, with the entire town turning out to celebrate. The ceremony was held in the church, with wildflowers and autumn leaves decorating the simple space. Penelope wore a gown of ivory satin ordered from Denver, and Rusty looked more handsome than ever in a new black suit. As they exchanged vows, Penelope couldn't help remembering their first meeting, how she had judged him based on appearances and rumors, how he had seen beyond her proper Boston facade to the woman within. They had both overcome first impressions to discover something true and lasting. The reception was held at the Half Moon, of course, with tables groaning under the weight of food contributed by every family in Green River. When the band struck up the first dance, Rusty led Penelope onto the floor amidst cheers and applause. "Remember when they laughed at you trying to dance?" He murmured as they moved together in perfect harmony. "And you said, 'Just step where I step,'" she recalled with a smile. Best advice I ever gave," he said, pulling her closer, "because look where it led us." As they danced beneath the lantern light, surrounded by friends who had become family, Penelope knew that she had found her place in this wild, beautiful land. With Rusty by her side, every step forward was a step toward home. In the spring of 1879, their house on the hill was completed, a sturdy two-story structure with a wide porch facing the valley. Rusty hired a reliable manager for the day-to-day operations of the saloon, allowing him more time to focus on their home and other business ventures. Penelope continued teaching, her classroom growing as more families moved to the prospering town. By the summer of 1880, their family expanded with the birth of their first child, a son they named James after Rusty's father. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Elizabeth, who inherited her mother's chestnut hair and her father's bright blue eyes. The children grew strong in the clean mountain air, dividing their time between the schoolhouse where their mother taught and the saloon where their father worked, equally at home in both worlds. As the years passed, Green River grew from a frontier outpost into a thriving community. Wyoming achieved statehood in 1890, and Penelope proudly cast her vote in the first election, a right she would not have had in her native Massachusetts. Rusty, always with an eye toward the future, expanded his business interests beyond the saloon, investing in the railroad and banking ventures that helped the town prosper. Their home on the hill became known for its hospitality, hosting gatherings that brought together people from all walks of life: ranchers and merchants, teachers and cowboys, old-timers and newcomers. And at these gatherings, there was always dancing, with Rusty and Penelope leading the way, still moving together as perfectly as they had on their wedding day. On their 25th anniversary, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and the community they had helped build, Rusty pulled Penelope onto the dance floor of the Half Moon one more time. "Any regrets, Boston?" he asked as they swayed to the music, silver now threading through his dark hair, laugh lines framing her still bright eyes. "Not a single one," she replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "Every step with you has been the right one." And as they danced beneath the same rafters where they had first discovered love, Penelope thought of all the journeys that had led them here, from Boston to Green River, from strangers to lovers, from tentative first steps to the confident dance of a life shared. In the end, it had all been as simple and as profound as following Rusty's advice from that very first night: just step where I step.